Okay, so Adrian van Hooydonk, back in 2010 or 11 or so, expressed it very nicely, really, when he said that design has become more about storytelling and reflects life, really, that life has become more about experiences than about collecting things. Now, if we look at that expressed perhaps in a little retrospective of BMW marketing and how they've evolved, because this is linked with product, obviously. You can see back in 60s and 70s, and actually through the 80s, that BMW was, you know, its catchphrase, its tagline was the ultimate driving machine. The focus there on product, on performance, on technical, proficiency, if you like. And then there was a transition in the early noughties through this branding message around joy, and quite often the commercials would just be the three-letter word joy, and different scenarios with people, different situations and friends in a BMW. So we kind of transitioned to how the vehicle makes you feel, which is interesting because that's starting to move towards this experiential push. And now with the kind of the latest EV concept that they proposed a couple of years ago now, you know, there was a marketing campaign, certainly within the automotive world, that looked at this kind of very personal experience. There were people, as a couple, kind of, you know, having a date basically in the back of the car as it was driving autonomously. And it's focusing in on that personal experience within the vehicle. How does the vehicle enhance or enable a really personal experience? So there's definitely been this evolution in how vehicles are marketed to us. And if we look at someone else's perspective, so this is JLR, who have a research hub, in fact, on Warwickshire campus, dedicated to vehicle experience as well. And they talk about the fact that the car is now only just a small part of the journey, and the journey itself is much bigger than the hard surfacing of the vehicle itself. And you can look at that in other aspects as well. So the latest that was introduced probably 3 months ago now, amongst the launch images and press imagery, were a couple of images like this, really, where they took the seats from the car and they've interpreted them as a living space. And that's really making that connection very clearly, that it's moving away from mobility to reflect, more personal aspects of our own life. So what we need to do really to move your initial projects on is to understand how we can define a user experience, and also just explore and discuss a little bit about why it's so important to design keeping that user experience at the forefront of our minds. A little bit of background psychology here, which will help us as we move forward through this presentation. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure many of you will have seen. This is a method that Philip Maslow, I think in the 30s, way back when, established. And it's a very important hierarchy that talks about this self-actualization area here, which is what people want to achieve. And this is linked to working one's way through achieving things in your life. So, you know, if you achieve the basic needs, things like security, a roof over your head, food, water, etc., you've kind of satisfied the bottom point of this hierarchy. We move up a little bit further in sophistication in terms of how we interact with products and what we buy, for instance, to look at things like esteem needs and belongingness and love. So this is linked to feeling positive and having a feeling of accomplishment, and perhaps a level of status that you achieve through working your way up through this model. And at the top really is this idea that humans strive to reach their full potential, and that full potential, Maslow argued, includes creative activities, bettering oneself, and adding self-fulfillment to your experience. So you could kind of break this down really in marketing terms, which is what I've done here. And this is the very simple approach of, you know, you need a solution to a problem. I need to get from A to B, put it that way, if we're talking about transport. The next stage on this process would be that actually I want more than that. I want a vehicle that represents my status, that reflects my personality, my character. And that becomes deep-rooted in the psychological needs of the consumer or the user. So that might be buying into a particular brand in favor of another. And there are some people put this and have other branches on top of this, but you can broadly say that now what we're looking at here is the idea that we expect to have an experience that gives us something, improves our life in some way, perhaps by buying a particular product or buying into a particular brand. It more than reflects a status or what I want to show to people, but it actually enhances and enriches my own feelings and how I feel about myself, self-actualization. So it's a very simple approach, and some people have kind of changed it over time, but it really does help in terms of understanding what becomes a good experience or an experience. So that will help us design our own experience around the concept that we're progressing over the next few days. And so if we take this a little bit further, we just concentrate on this top point of self-actualization. So we can say that the result of meeting this self-fulfillment area is that we have a positive user experience. And there could be many definitions of that, and that could be quite personal, but I'm going to say that a positive user experience can be defined as one that is useful, usable, and desirable. So everything works, it's easy to use, and I feel strongly positively about that experience as well. And as an aside, you know, a positive user experience generally will make the user more likely perhaps to grow some kind of product attachment to what the vehicle or the product they're using is. It'll give them a feeling of desirability, and also strong elements of brand loyalty, which is really why companies are very interested in focusing on this area to generate experiences. So as a subset of that positive user experience, this is quite an interesting kind of category here. So we're talking about positive experiences here, but within that, there are another couple of categories. So there's a reductive category and there's an additive category. So reductive is focused on reducing pain points in an experience. So let's say, you know, I get in my car and I want to go somewhere and I get stuck in traffic, and that causes me stress. So by reducing that as a pain point, you actually add to this being a positive experience. Other elements around this area can be cost. So let's say the example of shared ownership or a car club. You know, by reducing the cost involved in traveling, you're giving someone a positive user experience. Danger, perhaps a difficult word to use, but that's really about safety effectively, that by reducing danger, we can improve our user experience. And the same with things like congestion, et cetera, et cetera. This is no means an exhaustive list. This is just an example. And then we move to additive, which is perhaps where we more naturally feel positive user experience can be categorized. And that's, you know, clearly improving experience. And hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. That could be things like relaxation, as we've talked about, socializing, enabling socializing, entertaining, and even learning, you know, improving our own knowledge through an experience itself. So positive user experiences can be broken down into these two categories, and it's quite helpful to kind of split them so you can see, you know, where your idea, where your concept is really focusing on and leaning on as well. So this can be quite a useful breakdown to understand your user experience. So, okay, that's fine. That's a little bit of theory. So how can we generate a positive user experience? What we need to do here is split into two parts. The first part is to leverage the trends, the forecasts, and hopefully your own insights from what you've just done, and to use those to generate a scenario that has real relevance to the user. That's the first part. The second part is to then build a compelling user experience that exceeds the needs and desires of that user. So we're going to generate a scenario, and then we're going to build up the user experience, okay, around that scenario. Could I suggest, is mute okay, please? Because I'm hearing
sorry.
Keywords. Yep. Okay. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit more. We talked about the 2 points here. The first is to generate a scenario. And, you know, what is a scenario? Hopefully everyone has their own kind of interpretation. And effectively, a scenario will help us focus our design efforts on the user requirements and their experience. To build a scenario, what we need is to have a basic understanding of the typical tasks that the concept you develop will support. And we also need an understanding of the users and the context of how they might use the vehicle in question. But the key thing is to understand some tasks that we can build a picture around. So we've got a couple of examples here, and as Peter mentioned, mind maps are very useful at this early stage to kind of break down and categorize some tasks that are linked to a concept. So I've done a very simple example here where I've pulled out a bunch of trends, and some of these cover what we've talked around in some sense. And let's take the trend of vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So an example might be that we then put that into a context. I've just used contact as an understanding as to how that works. And I've put a context as personal, commerce or commercial, and also the safety context of vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So you can then start to break down the start of tasks, which we can then populate and illustrate in more detail, which we'll do shortly. So let's just have a look at personal. So vehicle-to-vehicle communication in a personal context could lead us to delve deeply around all of these possible scenarios, really. And each of them will have certain tasks around how you interact with this particular situation. So eating, for instance, social or gaming, or a pure kind of experience that the vehicle-to-vehicle connection offers us. And then there are crossovers as well to commerce with, you know, dining, for instance, dating as well, social, gaming experience, etc., etc. So there's a big crossover here. And these are just examples, really, of how you can then extrapolate some of these overall tasks further. And what I'm going to do here is just show you, let's take the example of commute as well. So this is using a customer journey map. So you can build a very simple kind of mind map of stretching elements out from trends onwards. And then you can start to populate a potential journey. So we could take what we've taken, what we've listed on that previous slide. I'm going to take commute here as an example. And what we do here is we can put together some of the tasks in a bit more detail. So, you know, commute on its own is not detailed enough. We need to actually drill down and interrogate what that journey is. So I've put here, as an example, 35 miles commute on the M40 motorway at 8:15 a.m. And some of the tasks that might be intrinsic to that journey, that scenario, are as follows. I've listed them here. And we've got load bags into car, drop kids at school, hit the toll booth, go on the highway. And those are the very simple basic tasks that I'm going to be running through on this particular journey. You'll see here what I've done. You can add drivers, passengers, kids, etc., to add some kind of granularity to what you're doing. And also for each of these tasks, a very good idea, good practice is to understand some elements that work and some elements that don't. So these are called gain points and pain points. There may be other kind of descriptions of those, but they very helpfully let you understand positives within that task, or around that task, I should say, and then possible pain points which you can really focus some of your design efforts on. So what I've got here is, you know, I load bags into car, I pick up a coffee, that's a great thing, but I have to queue for my coffee. That's a pain point which maybe some element of the design could in the future be focused upon. Drop kids at school, yeah, fine, but I have to maneuver through traffic. That's a pain point. It takes time on my journey, etc., etc. So you can kind of see how you can start to build this picture, generate this scenario slowly. And what I'd recommend is a customer journey map is a very good starting point to kind of add, as I mentioned, this granularity around the areas of interaction with your possible concept. So we don't know what the vehicle is at this stage. We're just populating a scenario. Okay. And what I would say is that you can do that quite easily with a lot of these tools. And Peter's made some really good suggestions there. And Miro is another that Eric and I have mentioned. But the key output from this is that you want your scenario to be interesting and relevant to people. So what you could do is really make a simple, basic scenario journey like I've done, which is actually pretty dull. And you could end up with something like get in car, drive downtown, pick up coffee, car parks itself, gets in car, returns home. That's fine. That's descriptive, really. And what we're after, if we refer back to the Maslow's hierarchical element here, is that we want to push that scenario further up the pyramid. We want less of this basic element of moving around and basic mobility. We want more of the experiential and positive experiential scenarios, because that's how you generate interest and passion and excitement in your concept effectively. People can relate and empathize to these elements of you know, fulfillment and self-fulfillment effectively. So that's an important criteria when we start to look at this in more detail. Try and focus on this top area here. We assume that these elements here are covered and generally are less interesting, less innovative. So as I mentioned, Miro is a great source. There's a link on the week 2 canvas, and I definitely recommend getting into that. You can generate all sorts of really interesting mapping data to help you organize your thoughts. And what we need to do then, with hopefully some of this kind of rationale behind your scenario, is to translate that into visuals. So everybody knows about storyboards. They are ubiquitous. They are the convention by which designers effectively, but also, you know, other disciplines communicate a journey. And again, on here, guidance would be that they don't have to be too literal. You know, a very literal storyboard that just explains those very simple basics of the journey is not a lot of use. It doesn't tell me much. It doesn't bring the story, the scenario to life. So one way of kind of counterbalancing that is to just focus on a couple or one really strong in-use situation. So a snapshot, as I've put it here, of an emotional part of the journey, perhaps a memory. You know, if you think back to your own memories, perhaps, you know, if I think back to being a kid and being in a car in a safari park, you know, I'm not thinking of the car there. I'm just thinking of being in the back seat looking at a lion, but being with my family at the same time and having a great time. So maybe you can lean on those elements of a scenario that you create to try and gather an emotional snapshot, a memory. So let's have a look at some examples. This is not that example of the emotional snapshot. It is a great project that one of our students did, a fantastic idea in many respects, about a sort of library effectively that could be used on demand. You call the vehicle up, it whisks you away to a nice green space, and it's full of books that you've ordered, and you could just sit there and read in your lunch hour, or, you know, take an afternoon and read the papers, etc., etc. It was very nicely realized in the end. And, you know, to be fair, this is a very simple, clear storyboard. It's conventional. We have an understanding of how it unfolds left to right, typically in our culture, and we understand that, you know, this is the end. So this journey has been well and rationally thought through, put it that way. But it doesn't necessarily grab you or bring you into the vehicle itself. So there are other ways of getting a little bit closer to the experience and creating that emotive kind of snapshot that we're after here. This one's a little bit closer. We have the kind of rationale here, which is not particularly exciting in itself. The vehicle picks you up, it moves away from the megacity, takes you in this case to the forest, and you learn a little bit about the forest, and you get away from it all. So it's that idea of escapism, not particularly creatively shown, but it's a strong idea. But what starts to bring this to life are these little kind of snapshots, these little personal elements where actually we're not really seeing the car, we're seeing a snapshot of that experience. So we understand that this is a connected vehicle. We understand there's some kind of avatar or hologram that's you know, interacting and helping Sarah, in this case, perhaps reach some level of self-fulfillment through education or whatever it is in this particular instance. And here we have a very nice kind of social snapshot that puts into context the interior experience itself. So what I'm saying here is the rationale, the pragmatic elements of that journey need to be given your own creative storytelling to bring them to life. And there's another couple of examples here where, again, we've got one scenario here of the vehicle in use, but it's quite a strong one. And that idea is that we can use other areas on the vehicle to interact with the vehicle, but also to interact with nature. So sure, you can sit on the hood of your car as is, that's all good. But what if we built some seating element and a kind of perch on top of the vehicle so you can get a new perspective on nature when you drive out to the country, for instance? That's quite a strong emotive element of the scenario. I don't know how this person drove there. I don't care what interstate they took, it doesn't matter. This is the kind of emotive snapshot that captures the essence of the concept and is much more powerful for people. So, you know, use your own imagination to really pull these ideas to life at this stage. Another much more polished example, and obviously there's an idea of what the vehicle is in these cases, but this is introducing some element of lifestyle around this vehicle. So, you know, it's a vehicle in this case that the person is taking to show off at a concours or salon privé or something like that event. And the same here, that it's a kind of it's a race vehicle as well. So it's about, this particular vehicle was about this connection, but also the status approach. So I guess what I would like to get across with these examples really is that you can show us snapshots that aren't the nitty-gritty of the vehicle, you know, on a journey. They can be much more emotive. I think there's this one I'm just going to share through quite quickly. This is a very nice example from a Chinese student of ours. And, you know, it's creating a story. It's creating this ambience, this atmosphere, which is kind of a little bit menacing, a little bit kind of intriguing in some respects, but the technology of a responsive vehicle that comes and collects you, the person going to, in this case, a fashion show, presenting an award, doing business, and the vehicle chaperoning you back home. It's almost like your own personal butler, if you like. So really nice sketches and a strong kind of intriguing story, a little bit kind of dark as well, which makes it intriguing in some respects. And here's proof that, you know, this is not just something that students do, for sure. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this in press releases. This is quite a nice example. Obviously, at the end of the process, where the vehicle is fully defined and it's, you know, an overlay of the CAD model. But it really brings, in this case, the Renault Trésor. You know, it gives you an understanding of what's going on. It's kind of, it's not an urban vehicle. We're in the desert scrub. We're on a road trip. We're looking at some, you know, possibly some deserted architecture. There's some intrigue there that makes you want to know a little bit more about this story. So it's a powerful tool to get your a visual story and visual scenario to life. Okay, one other element of this before we look at personas is to add some level of journey detail to flesh out your scenario. And the really relevant part of this is that it starts to provide you with some basic specifications that your concept might need. An example, so here we have this camping vehicle, and we've got a typical journey shown here in infographics. We've got an idea of the duration that the vehicle will be used for, and we've got some examples of the range that the vehicle will travel on, the distance traveled. Now you might think, well, you know, this is all kind of theoretical. It is, but it really feeds clearly into elements of your design. So just quickly to illustrate that, if we look at the top element here, the infographic of where the vehicle operates, we can start to understand perhaps that it needs to be a particular size. If you're going to be focused in the city, which is where you live, the start and end point of the journey, you're not probably thinking about a 6-meter long camping vehicle. If you travel and we're going from mountain to city and back again to city, it might give you some indication of the overall, you know, very generic kind of performance that we're expecting of this vehicle. And likewise, with the duration of the trip, the duration, how long people are going to be in this vehicle for. Now that's going to have implications and will inform the design specification, particularly around things like comfort, and the size of the cabin, for instance. If you've got 3 or 4 people in there for 2 to 3 days, that's a serious consideration. And also the kind of amenities that you have, the equipment that actually helps you function for that long within this vehicle. And then if we look at another bit of journey detail, the range, you know, you get the message that that gives you some idea perhaps of powertrain, the infrastructure that you might be designing around, if it's hydrogen or something else like that. And also whether it's, you know, an off-road, on-road, motorway, etc. kind of performance that you're designing for. All of those elements will feed and inform the basic concept, which you can then start designing for. So these are really quite important tools to flesh out your scenarios. Okay, and then the second part of this is built around personas, and Ford featured a little bit in this because they are actually quite were quite ahead of the curve probably about 20 years ago now, 15, 20 years ago. And I'll give you a couple of examples, but I don't know who in Ford coined this phrase, but it was introduced around the time of Verve, the Verve concept, which was the Fiesta B299. And around that time, there was a discussion around, to design the car, first design the driver. And that's become quite prescient now, as quite a lot of design is focused on the experience and the user experience. So personas, you've heard that phrase, I'm sure. They are critical for informing the user experience, and certainly how to improve or innovate around the user experience. And typically by identifying different target customers or personas and plotting their journey, it tends to enable this better understanding, this deeper understanding of the pain points that I mentioned, but also what they might enjoy, find valuable from that scenario, that journey, that experience. Okay, so very quickly, background here. This is the traditional approach, and many companies still use this kind of this way of thinking, really. And that's to identify target customers or personas, define them, and use them to influence the design, the essence of the design, the theme, if you like. And that's a very strong and sensible approach, and it has many uses. It looks at things like, you know, where do they live, their typical journeys, where do they shop, size of the family, what they buy, etc., etc. So my kind of take on this approach is that it really covers these elements very well. It covers the basic needs of moving about in safety and security, and you know, perhaps some elements of status linked to brand, for instance, of what they buy, that kind of thing. Their social network, relationships, family, friends, blah, blah, blah. So that is typically the approach that many companies take. But what it doesn't necessarily do is really explore this area, which is, as I've said before, the key to generating an insightful user experience. So there's room for improvement with this traditional approach. But it did work, and here's an example, which is when I was at Ford as well. This is part of the development for Verve, as I said. And Ford generated this persona called Antonella. You might have heard of that. It was quite a big thing in you know, the launch of Fiesta, etc. And that was when the Fiesta was then relaunched back into the US as well. So it was quite a big deal. And basically, Antonella was a character that was generated by planning and designers. And it was really to embody the philosophy of that phrase, to design the car, first design the driver. And the level of detail was really very interesting. A whole kind of in-depth scenario and lifestyle was fleshed out around Antonella. And there were some phrases, key phrases, that really informed the design. So for instance, she cares more about the design and function of her cell, her mobile, than that of her car, which at the time was kind of, what? But now, you know, that's quite common, and certainly for a younger generation, you could certainly argue that is very, you know, that's very prescient. They hit the nail on the head there. Her priorities from a design perspective were seen to be the car's center console, the central panel, and therefore the controls were informed by those of a cell phone. And I think it was the Motorola Razr, that was really the inspiration for those angled touch points on the center stack. And there was also this idea that the dashboard with its binnacles was a frame around, you know, her glasses frame, high fashion glasses. And this idea that actually she would rather not eat so well for a few days, save up money and buy her favorite shoes. So, you know, a little bit of a kind of mythical idea perhaps, but it certainly builds the picture around this user. So that's, you know, that in a way was, in automotive terms, was quite a game changer, I think. And that was back in like 2004, 5, something like that, I think, with Verve. So a long time ago. But what I'm going to propose now is to move into that top part of the self-actualization pyramid. We need to kind of go beyond that description of the user, which is what Antonella started to do, really. And I think we want to move towards empathizing with their values, their aspirations and experiences. You might not like them, you know, they might not be aligned with what you think, but you know, by understanding them and what motivates them and their aspirations, you start to really be able to generate much more emotive kind of snapshots around the vehicle in use. And that's what we're after here, effectively. Oops. Okay. So that image there, I was meant to be a fade out, so we were going to have a quick chat about that. It's a shame. But anyway, I don't know what you see there, but I kind of thought about it for a minute and thought, you know, that shows, it's an interesting image. The red's brutal, but it, to me, I think independence, there's a bit of rebellion there. There's a bit of nonconformity. There's also a kind of an odd, maybe a kind of gender reversal here. She's standing on what, you know, Lamborghinis are very, possibly the most macho of the supercars, and she's, you know, with no respect, skating on the top of the roof. So it's an interesting image, and it can kind of generate a discussion around what it might visualize to you. If we take the next image, which is potentially something very different, you know, that's a snapshot of what we assume is a couple sitting on top of a high-rise building, sharing a moment. It's a snapshot, it's a memory, but it can also describe a number of things. It can describe this idea of escapism. It could describe the idea of calm in the storm, you know, this sort of sea of tranquility idea, and turning off from one's life a little bit and having a moment of just being. It's not a storyboard, but it's a snapshot of a storyboard, and that's the important point that I want to get across with this section. And it's a snapshot of the personas as well. The next little phase here is to leverage the resources around generational data as well. So to do some research around the personas themselves. Now, there's pluses and minuses of this. You know, the Gen Z, the Alpha, the Boomers, etc., etc. They can be very useful. They can be very useful to build up big landscape and generic ideas around those different demographics. Certainly, that's some of their values, and they will give you those pointers to some of those kind of motivations behind those demographics in different age groups. Some people question the fact that they're very sort of broad brush in how they deal with people, but certainly for the case of initial research, there are some excellent kind of resources out there. Again, Goldman Sachs have some really good insights. I've put a link there, and I've also put a couple of links in the canvas that will allow you to delve a little bit deeper into those existing generational studies. But it's worth saying that how you actually choose to communicate that persona, it can be pretty nuanced. And if we go back to the kind of original approach that I mentioned, where you say, right, this is this person, they live here, they buy these brands, they do this journey, that does not bring the doesn't really capture that emotional element that we're after. And you can be far more nuanced with the details around that. So for instance, this image from, at the time, Renault designer Stéphane Janin, you know, what do you read from that image? What do you guys see from that person and that kind of scenario? Anything?
A bit confusing. It looks like there's a delivery vehicle and then there's a personal vehicle. I'm assuming it's the same chassis. It's a module that drops on top of the chassis.
In terms of the person, though, Peter, what and persona, what do you see there?
Oh, right. Yeah, I need to put my glasses on, mate. So she's a youngster, right?
Yeah.
A youngster. God.
You gave the game away there.
Yeah. So young. You've given her some income.
Well, no. I guess what I'm saying with that is a question about, you know, you can make some assumptions,
yeah,
based on what you're sharing with us around those elements about, you know, is she fashionable? The label on the bag.
Yeah.
You know, the link to IKEA, for instance, which, you know, is has got some perceptions around it, positive as well as negative, but they kind of detail some of the lifestyle. Perhaps, you know, she might have just moved in with her boyfriend or whatever it is, and they're building their house, etc., etc. So I guess what I'm trying to exemplify there is that the persona can be this sort of story in itself that you're telling and sharing with us, rather than the factual elements of exactly how much she earns, how exactly how old she is, etc., etc. Those tend to be the ones that stick with you a little bit more when you see it in these kind of contexts. Okay, yeah, okay. And so the other way of approaching this as well, slightly kind of less conventionally perhaps, because mood boards and inspiration boards typically are around product or material. You know, CMF certainly do a lot of this, atmospheres, etc., etc. But there's nothing to stop you from creating a mood board, you know, as a snapshot of the persona themselves. You know, the idea here is to bring creativity to these processes and to tell the story, to create your design narrative. So what you could do here is choose elements of, you know, items perhaps, or artifacts that are important to this person. Again, little snapshots or cropped areas. It could highlight, you know, their interest in sustainability, their interest in, you know, a particular kind of lifestyle, fashion, etc., etc., music, and it can be a visual exploration of that persona as well. So, as with a lot of these elements in the creative design process, there is no, this is the right way you do it. You know, you do need to kind of cover the areas that we've looked at and structure it so that it's a strong narrative, but you need to bring your own creativity and insight to generate really strong scenarios and persona maps here, really. I'm going to give you some further examples, and to finish off around those examples that I'll go through as well is really how we bring all of these elements together. So I think the way to look through this is that, I'm sorry, the numbers are not aligned, which is not great. So effectively, that should be number 1, 2, 3. To introduce the project, you've got already a snapshot of a theme that you're considering. And then the next stage from that is to start to think about presenting those key insights, the really strong elements of data from that initial research. And I'll go through some examples shortly to finish off. Then we want to kind of introduce people to the user. And as I've said, that can be through these emotive snapshots. And those can be, as visual as you'd like. And then we need to put that persona into this vehicle in use scenario, the journey, which then starts to give us elements that can inform the basic specification, the basic design of the vehicle. So that's really how to weave all of these elements together. Number 1 is what you've done last week. And it's a reflection on that and a presentation of the data. And number 2 is to build this imaginary persona, this user, and to start to understand the aspirations and motivations behind that person. And then the final element of that is to build this in-use scenario, which could be an element of a journey, which then starts to inform the basic design process. So here are a couple of examples to conclude this with. This is a typical kind of introduction approach for a project, and it's introducing this duality of the vehicle, that I don't want a camper van. I want my normal compact family car to actually have the functionality of a camper van and to be able to use it in these 2 different scenarios. So, if you can show that idea visually, that is really, really strong as well, through the use of infographics, etc. And also, you need to start to think about how you present your key data, your key insights from that trend research. There might be 2 or 3 really compelling elements of data or trends that you can capture in a snapshot, and start to build a story in terms of how you present the start of your project. Another example, just an example through infographics, really, of interpreting data, just 2 or 3 key elements of data here, and presenting them in a way that frames the story quite quickly. So population's growing, megacities, what can become the escape? And this particular student started to explore areas of Antarctica and the Arctic Circle to really understand if there was a potential to build a journey in that environment to have the ultimate escape. And like I say, this is just to reiterate, really, I think I showed you this one last time, that the vehicle in use snapshots, I'm not, everyone's got their own level of work here and different level of presentation. We're not expecting, concept art from all of you. You can take existing imagery and use that to communicate elements of the vehicle in use. They can be snapshots or memories, particularly emotive images, etc., to illustrate your ideas behind it. But these are, if you can do this, fantastic. It really pulls the story together. I would say, for instance, there's a very good website, I find it very useful anyway, called unsplash.com, which is royalty-free, Creative Commons high-res imagery. Yep. Free to use, very good. Other people might have more, which we can hopefully share on the canvas as well. And then this is an example from Behance, which I think does quite a good example, quite a good job of introducing a particular project. So this is something you could look at. This is around the idea of the nomad, so a freelance worker who doesn't own a house but would want to stay in a vehicle that he could rent or she could rent and use. So an understanding of the kind of background, the scenario here, and perhaps his initial thoughts about an ownership model. A little bit of background with almost a rhetorical question, which very nicely frames the trend, which is, you know, housing in Tokyo is tiny and incredibly expensive and limited because there's a lot of people there. And then starts to bring this idea of the persona to the forefront, some of the requirements, or if you like, tasks that this person might need on their journey in the use of the vehicle. And then starts to pull together some examples of who this persona could be, looking at kind of perhaps some of their motivations and their attitudes towards life. It's quite a transient lifestyle, and you know, it's quite a unique project, and this is quite a unique take on it. But again, it's so visual that it really is compelling, and it pulls you into the story of what this could be. And then finally, this project starts to introduce snapshots along the way in the storyboard. So it starts off with how the vehicle is used or accessed, as it's a shared vehicle, and then how the person interacts with the vehicle, actually, you know, doing their work within it, and then how it works perhaps within a broader infrastructure, if that's relevant to your own idea, your own concept as well. And finally, just to wrap this up, just an example from good old Ford, and this is Paul Wraith, who used to be one of my bosses in Dunton. He's now over in Dearborn. He's the Bronco chief designer. Very nice guy. And these are quotes from an interview he gave around the Bronco design process. But it's, you know, really backs up this idea that humans are placed in the center of the thinking around this particular vehicle. Nice quote about people would take pictures out of their wallets and tell stories of their brother's old Bronco or the one that their dad had as a kid. And, you know, they got passed on through families. They were part of the family, being such an iconic car. And based on those personal stories, the race team created 5 fictitious users and designed the Bronco lineup around them. We designed for the people by name. We understood their hopes and inspirations and storyboarded around that. And here are some examples of, you know, we're not necessarily seeing much of the vehicle. It's all in kind of ghosted out elements. What we're focusing on is how the vehicle's being used. You know, bag wrapped on there, dog, this cover. There was a really nice requirement around the lifestyle of the Bronco user that resulted in 2 mountain bikes fitting, you know, together within the boot space, the trunk space of this vehicle. And that's something that from lifestyle informed the package, informed the design of the Bronco. So a good example of it in action, basically. Yeah, okay, and just describing the format that Ford used here with comic strip type doodles showing drivers in action. Obviously, we're, you know, maybe in a blizzard, going hiking, got a dog. It's all there. The lifestyle's explained clearly. And finally, yeah, I guess, you know, they'd been play football or mountaineering, whatever, but there's an understanding of the vehicle facilitating and enabling that lifestyle, that the persona to reach those experiences and to enjoy those experiences. Okay, so to wrap up, I know I was a little bit rushed, but I have to head off, is what we need to look at for next week. And I've just given a couple of bullet points here, which hopefully we can go through now, and if there are any sort of questions around that, we can sort those out. But if you take your, it's up to you how you want to do this. You could focus in on the one particular trend that you want to pursue, you want to develop a concept around, or if you want to have two running concurrently at this point and then narrow down to one. And what you need to do is to think about how to visually communicate a future scenario that is informed by that trend or that forecast. Then I'd like you to think about and generate two distinct personas, users of the concept. And you can show those, as I've said, visually, a little bit of background information, but it should be, you know, telling the story visually of who they are, their hopes, their dreams. You can start to build a journey map, you know, and that can be this this simple approach of detailing a typical journey with pain points and plus points, what they typically do within that journey. And you can use that map to then start to create a scenario, a visual scenario, or call it a storyboard, whatever you'd like. But that's the kind of process that I'd like to see being generated from those trend and project ideas that you've you know, collected and shared with us. And what would be great is next week, obviously we have our one-to-ones, but if next week, if we get to the point where we each have a sort of basic document that has some detail around these tasks, I think we're going to start to see the project shape into something quite interesting and thought-provoking, I think, and that's what I'd look for next week. Okay, so any questions on that? I know the name. Guru. She's in Dearborn, right? Is that right? Okay. Yeah, the name rings a bell. I don't have any dealings with her personally, but yeah, it's definitely something that Ford, you know, really, you know, took the lead on with back with Antonella, and they made it a massive part of their publicity for Verve and Fiesta. And it really informed design process. And that's if you're working in a studio, as Eric's saying, that's you get that opportunity to get that data, which is real data, you know, from observing people. I did quite a bit of this. We had Seymour Powell working with us in Ford, and we had to go around. It was kind of crazy, but we had to go around to various people's houses around London. We'd sit with them, we'd talk with them, we'd understand what their lives were like. Then we'd go out in the car with them and observe a typical kind of 20-minute journey, and they would talk and narrate the pinch points and the gain points of driving their Fiesta, and explain, you know, I really like how this one does this. And then we'd go across to competitor vehicles and have that same narrative of this in-use scenario. Obviously, you don't, you know, when you're building a kind of theoretical project, you don't have that luxury, you don't have that data, but that mm. Mm. That's right. So that's that positive experience, isn't it? You know, and the self-fulfillment element as well. Guys, I've got to go and collect my daughter because my partner's away. So I think we've I think we're good for time. But if anyone has specific questions, just fire me an email. I'm very happy to spend extra time going through stuff. That's no problem at all. And I'll upload the full version of this. I'm sorry it got truncated on the PDF for some reason. Okay, so that's it for the moment, and I'll leave you the task sheet up as well.
Yeah.
Which is this one? Are you still seeing that, I guess? Okay.
Yeah.
Any thoughts or quick comments before I sign off? Or are you just all kind of just taking some time out?
Great.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, this
Okay.
is super cool. I'm excited to dive in, so thanks.
Awesome.